want to introduce Brian. So welcome back, Brian. He did a talk with us last year as well, so thank you. So Brian Laythe is the founder and director of the Institute for the Study of Religious and Anomalous Experience, the ISRAE, and managing partner of Ludicium, a forensic psychology consultancy. He obtained his master's and doctorate degrees in experimental psychology from the University of New Hampshire. Laythe is also lead author of Ghosted, Exploring the Haunted Reality of Paranormal Encounters, and co-host of the new Practical Parapsychology show on the Niagara TV and radio network. So Brian will be talking to us about the next gen study of ghostly episodes. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you very much. Assuming everybody can hear me because I'm wearing this fancy headset now from doing podcast shows and stuff. Let me share my screen and we can get rolling on this.
Right.
Bam. Okay, can everybody see this? See the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so obviously I am not Jim Horan, so I apologize. You're welcome to pretend I'm him if you want, but that will probably be somewhat disappointing. But Jim was nice enough at least to put this nice photo of me in a graveyard from back in the day, so that was kind of a nice touch. So let's have, we're going to be telling a bit of a story today. Because really what we're doing is kind of summarizing our research over a 5-year period, which ended up being over 25 peer-reviewed articles. And, you know, kind of the impetus of this was that, of course, Jim published a series of essays in 2001 looking at hauntings and poltergeists from a, you know, kind of a neutral perspective. It had believers, it had skeptics, and a lot of commentary about kind of what was the state of the art at the time of hauntings and poltergeists. So, you know, when 20 years came around, the question was, should we take another stab at this? And, you know, let's see what's been done with regards to hauntings and poltergeist research, but, you know, also what needs to be done. And so what we ended up doing was, you know, basically gathering together an international team. And that international team was a variety of researchers who had various kind of belief assumptions about the paranormal. I always openly advocate that I'm a believer, right? That's just my background. It's what I am. But, you know, we also had very strong skeptics that worked with us over 5 years, and people somewhere in between. You know, the idea was that, you know, ideologically diverse authors would kind of help us be honest about, you know, basically doing, well, focusing more on the data and the model as opposed to the interpretation of the model. And, you know, one of the points or one of the major themes you're going to see as I talk today about, you know, the book and the research is that interactionism is a very, very dear to our heart psychological premise. You know, there is loads of social science research, you know, so much that it might fill a room, that has made a very, very strong data, philosophical, logical, and historical case that there is what we observe, and then there is also our interpretation of what we observe. And, you know, unfortunately, sometimes we even see this in science where there are a bunch of assumptions ideologically or theologically that magically get applied to the findings, right? And part of our goal in doing this book was being very honest that there is an interaction going on when we're dealing with not only hauntings and poltergeists, but frankly, all of our interactions in the world around us. There's certainly nothing controversial either in mainstream science or in parapsychology saying that beliefs and culture and even the state of our body plays a role in how we interpret various types of phenomena, right? So as we kind of go through this model together, you're going to see that keeps playing a role. We have an implicit understanding from the data that there is, our cultural belief background influences, there are psychological trait influences, and, there's even, the physical variables in the environment and in ourselves that are all going to play a role when we're trying to make sense and develop models for hauntings. So the result of 5 years was my blatant book pitch that you can see before us, Ghosted, which is a full, basically a layperson report, or hopefully easy to read by the layperson, summary of all of this research, where we looked at sociocultural variables, we looked at psychological variables, and of course physical and environmental variables, in terms of trying to create a good model for accurately predicting and better understanding how and why hauntings occur. As I said before, it was a participatory team science approach. It was international, neither US or UK centric. We had people with different, PhDs and different backgrounds, and of course, inclusive in terms of our ideology. And most importantly, again, because of this recognition that our beliefs very often can shape the way we look at data, we wanted to focus on the actual science, relationships, and data in hopes of building a model, right? A good predictive model that would, give us some reliable results in a variety of domains. And here, of course, you can see our other co-authors, Ciaran O'Keefe, Kent Drinkwater, Neil Dagnall. But we start with, starting to quantify the idea of what are the signs or symptoms of a ghostly episode. Now, for those of you with strong parapsychology backgrounds, there are various scales out there. The anomalous experiences inventory, for instance, Kumar and Pecula. But we wanted to try and make a haunting, a haunting centric measure. We wanted a measure that was going to really address the core phenomena. And this is why we talk about phenomenology a lot. We weren't interested in, I saw little green fairies. We were interested in, I saw a type of apparition which looked this way. Or instead of the ghost flew, the ghost flung an object across the room, we wanted to make sure it was like, no, I saw an object move. So we wanted to start looking at the core actual things that are observed or felt in a haunting environment. So, the contents, and not only the contents in terms of what's experienced, but what sort of structure is there, and what kind of nuances would we possibly see when we started to examine these various types of events. Well, after a very large study, and a very comprehensive view of the literature, we ended up crafting a 32-item scale that represented, kind of consistent signs or symptoms that show up with people who experience hauntings, right? And of course, for people familiar with hauntings, these were, subdivided into subjective versus objective types of phenomena. Right. So also, symptoms that are present across cases of ghosts, haunts, and poltergeists. Right. Although I'm not going to go into it a lot tonight, we don't necessarily make a distinction between the poltergeist versus the ghost. And if somebody wants to tackle me on that during Q&A, you're welcome to do it. But, obviously, if you guys have any backgrounds in hauntings, you have your subjective or psychological experiences, whether that could be a sense of smell, or whether you feel like a sensed presence is in the room, right? Notably, subjective events are internal to the person. And if I'm going to be, kind of a hard nose about it, very, very difficult to psychologically examine, right? Or empirically examine, because they are things happening within the person's five senses. Which, of course, one of the great philosophical conundrums is, without language, none of us can actually know what's going on in each side, in each other's heads, because we're trapped by those five senses, or a sixth sense. Let's also add that sixth sense, right? But the bottom line is, without language, what's happening in my head, or what I am perceiving or experiencing, is not something that anyone else can understand, because I'm trapped by my five sense organs, just as you're trapped by your five sense organs, right? So, subjective experiences are these internal events, but we also took into account objective events, stuff that can be recorded by a camera, stuff that was seen by multiple witnesses. So that's your classical psychokinesis, right? Audiovisual anomalies, bodily injuries, although you might make a case that that could be subjective as a function of a somatoform disorder, and even mysterious fires, which I can say I've actually seen once, which was insane. But one of the things that we did with the Survey of Strange Events, which is our 32-item scale, is that we employed Roche scaling, right, which is from modern test theory. And it's a bit of a very different bird than your standard test analysis, so your standard factor analysis, things along those lines. I won't go into all the mathematics of it, but essentially what we found was that subjective and objective events are not separate phenomena when it comes to looking at haunt phenomena. In fact, what's unique about our scale is that it basically represents a probabilistic hierarchy, right? So when we did our study, and we started using analytical methods with regards to the SSE, where we were looking not at what items fit together. That's obviously part of it. That's part of a factor analysis. But more importantly, is there, and that's the nice thing with Roche scaling, is there an interval level metric between these items, these events, haunted events occurring, in terms of their probabilities, right? So the SSE is really a probability hierarchy, where depending on the context of the group of people taking it, there is a very distinguishable probabilistic pattern where we can say there are rare, less common, and common haunting events that people experience, depending on the subset or lifestyle that they're into. Right. So we also know from Roche scaling that, our SSE is robust irrespective of age or gender effects. Which also is basically across multiple kind of backgrounds, such as, we did our primary analysis on what you would call spontaneous accounts, so people that weren't expecting paranormal phenomena to occur. But we also looked at lifestyle, a group of people that, regularly go to haunting tours or investigate. And we even had illicit people create false reports of hauntings. So we could actually do comparisons across these groups to see how items shifted. But interestingly enough, regardless of whether someone is playing make 'em up, whether they're a lifestyle person, so they're active in haunts and investigations, or it's spontaneous, S&O events do not separate into two factors. They will shift in their likelihood of probability, but they appear to be a unidimensional structure of high strangeness. So, by the best math we can come up with, the SSE is showing us that there is a backbone of high strangeness, and that both subjective and objective events have differing probabilities and will show up in different orders, depending on the background of the group that you are testing. So we felt good about that. And of course, one other aspect of our scale that we're proud of is it is, because it's in logits and probability, it is a genuine interval level scale of measurement. This is the same sort of analysis procedure that people at the SAT and GRE use to ensure that a score is actually a legitimate score in comparison to a person's ability. Well, in this case with the SSE, we're looking at whatever trait features predict the likelihood, right, of experiencing an event, and it's being set to, right, higher people's ability to experience haunts are associated with rare events. Right, so it's very much structured like a GRE exam would be in terms of its probabilities. So, well, and evidently I already went over all that because I forgot my next scale, so we can skip that, or my next slide, so we can skip that. But I would again emphasize that from all of the evidence that we've collected so far, separating S events from O events is probably not accurate. And again, even when you deal with people from different backgrounds and experiences with hauntings, to beat a dead horse, we still end up with a unidimensional probabilistic structure for the core phenomena that people interpret as haunting. So, one of our second points, right? So our first step was, well, let's get a good scale going so we can accurately measure various types of haunt experience in the real world. But then we had to tackle some of this interactionist issue and ask ourselves, what role do sociocultural influences play with regards to hauntings and poltergeists, right? So we know that, very simply because we're talking about interactionism, that people, when they report a haunting, are interacting in an environment, in a place. And yes, there may be core phenomena, right, that are occurring, but those phenomena subsequently get interpreted into a narrative that we define as a haunting, a spiritual intrusion, right? One of the key points here is understanding that hauntings don't necessarily, I mean, they do exist. I've certainly captured phenomena when I'm not around under laboratory grade conditions. But when we're talking about haunt narratives and haunting experiences, people are not passive witnesses to this. They are applying their belief systems. They are applying their previous experience. They are applying their sociocultural background into making sense of the strangeness that is happening to them, right? So as such, and I want to make it clear, I'm not degrading the haunting experience as not veridical. I want to make that very clear. I'm not saying they're not real. What I am saying is that our interpretation and our culture is playing a major process in this. We are not simply witnesses. Ghostly episodes and ghost stories and ongoing hauntings are narrative constructions, right? And a wide body of literature to support that. Right? The interpret. Well, I don't need that picture. So, right. So one of the things we did was introduce something called the VAPIS model. Right. So we did two very large scoping reviews looking at the role of ghost stories in culture over time. And over that, we came up with, at a broad sociocultural level, right, kind of 5 factors that essentially kind of hallmark the ghostly episode, right? And the first one is versatility, right? Ghost stories have this flexibility to represent a cross section of moods, locations, or themes, right? We've seen in Netflix over the last several years stories that are essentially, love stories integrated into a haunting. We've all heard ghost stories that are basically, cautionary tales of, if you do this, right, bad things are going to happen. And moving to real life, right? How many of you guys have heard the deadly Ouija board story? Oh, did you dabble with a Ouija board? If you dabbled with a Ouija board, devil's going to come, your child's going to get possessed, you're going to lose your house. You may have to do a double mortgage, right? It's also important to note that, ghost stories have adaptability. As society changes, the stories change, right? The themes change. The moral message underneath ghost stories change. They are participatory. Whether you're a believer or a skeptic, they invite interaction. People come running to be involved in these. They are universal, right? Everybody has an interest in them, whether they're trying to debunk them or be involved with them, or they're afraid with them, or just run away with them, right? And finally, we found this fifth theme of scalability. Right? Ghost stories engage with people collectively and individually, and they are contagious. These stories spread. They become famous. And if you really need a proof of that, just look at the amount of money various production companies and streaming companies have done to buy up legitimate ghost stories. Or if you guys are familiar with the Hell House in Gary, Indiana, the one that Ghost Adventurers claimed was possessed. Somebody actually bought up the rights to that story, and so now the people involved with it won't talk. Supposedly Netflix is going to be making a movie out of it. Now, granted, I'm also bringing up here kind of monetary opportunity, but our point is recognizing that while there are these obvious core signs and symptoms of hauntings, they're also a very popular meme in society, and that these stories spread and engage with people. So we're seeing this broad sociological interaction, as well as this individual interactionist effect with the person's belief trying to make sense of this anomalous phenomena. So, from this, right, narratives are vulnerable. contents or degrees of conviction can be influenced during their formation. So what we're saying here is that as ghost stories are spread, they are prone to group peer pressure and contagion effects. In other words, here we're talking about what might be called positive or negative gaslighting. If you've ever been a believer and shared that you are a believer among skeptics, right, who are less than kind, that's not a very fun process. And if you're familiar with cognitive psychology and retroactive and proactive memory interference, or unconscious contagion, you can see the stories and narratives of ghosts be shaped over time by the beliefs surrounding the person that's had the core experiences. Likewise, believers are going to be likely to foster more, right, exaggerated degrees of narrative around these events. They are contagious. They spread among social outlets and are contagious even in terms of their effects. There's plenty of research showing contagion effects in the laboratory where, I did a study in 2017 where phenomena that people verbally reported was massively reproduced within 5 to 10 seconds by other people simply because they said it and they were in a mock seance environment, right? Narratives are territorial, right? Identity, meaning, and conflict naturally occur among those with strong beliefs. And what we're really talking about here is this understanding that, there are diehard skeptics, there are diehard believers, and there's also, some social identity theory issues going on between, parapsychologists versus amateur ghost hunters. We need to recognize in the midst of hauntings and all of this phenomena that there are ego, group dynamics, and belief systems involved. And in fact, I would say most of the conflict that we deal with and most of the debates we even deal with in academic parapsychology are respectfully theology issues and not data issues. They're not issues of what does the data actually say. Was the study conducted correctly? There are massive fights over what does the data mean? What are the implications? Right. And I'm going to say I'm not going to represent Jim on this, but I would say on a personal note, that's something I'm very much trying to advocate for in general, which is all of us, including amateurs and lay people, need to be very honest about how our beliefs and desires for belief interpret the way we look at our data. Because I think a lot of times we end up getting into fights, not over the fact that science was done, but what the science means. And everyone benefits from looking at their assumptions on a regular basis. Right. So it's also worth noting, if you remember, I talked about that the SSE is a 32 item, hierarchical scale. It's a 1-factor scale. But we've already done several studies where we've been able to show that when you sample people with deep childhood imaginary friends, we did 2 studies on this, as well as gang stalking, you will find that if you interpret those accounts, that their phenomena that they're reporting actually also fits a profile on the SSE. So, this is a reinforcement because, if we're talking about imaginary friends, we really shouldn't see the sort of things that a person reports with a deep imaginary friend, such as talking or objects moving or seeing additional figures, but that occurs. That actually occurs with deep ICs. And we're actually finding that you can happily fit that on our 1-factor hierarchical model of haunting phenomena. We've also found that if you translate gang stalking accounts, guess what? It also fits nicely on our SSE. So we're starting to see a building amount of evidence to suggest that these core phenomena, core 32 items, might actually be a more generalized backbone for high strangeness. And it's not the phenomena itself that says it's a ghost or it's an imaginary friend or it's gang stalking. It's the person's cultural context and interpretation of these weird phenomena that in turn give them their flavor. Now, I want to be careful with that. I'm not saying that's absolutist, but we're seeing overlap and we are seeing statistical overlap that's pretty good. You can use the SSE to code these events and it is effective and it does work. So psychological influences, right? So that's our third piece of the puzzle. Why do some people have experiences and others do not? And I heard some conversation from John's talk that kind of leads into this, right? One of the important points we wanted to do was look at what actual trait variables best predict haunting experience, right? So not just paranormal belief, but what is it, what is it that actually predicts people having these experiences? And so in a more recent study, although I did a smaller version of this in 2012, we took a large sample, randomly split them in two, and we gave them anxiety and depression issues. I'm sorry, anxiety and depression. We gave them anxiety and depression issues. We messed those people up. Anxiety and depression scales, vulnerability, intellect scales, paranormal belief, the RASH scaled one with New Age philosophy and traditional paranormal beliefs, locus of control measures, fear of the paranormal, rational engagement, experiential ability, experiential engagement, and transliminality. And what we found from that study was that there were basically only two real predictive factors in regression that predicted haunting events. The subset of New Age philosophy or of paranormal beliefs. So essentially, to what extent do you believe paranormal phenomena can occur? But that was a secondary predictor. Our strongest predictor by far was transliminality. All of the other trait, experiential ability or intellectual processing variables were not significant predictors at all. General traits weren't, vulnerability wasn't, locus of control wasn't. It was just transliminality, this thin boundary structure, in conjunction with the belief that paranormal phenomena could occur. That was the largest predictor of having these experiences, right? So point three. So if we know that transliminality and paranormal belief are the primary predictors of having haunting experience, what are the physical factors, right? What are basically what is the role that physical buildings play, right? And this ties in nicely to John's talk about sacred spaces. Except I want to make a distinction here because, John is talking about, places possibly absorbing energy. Whereas our approach to this one was, let's look at the standard mainstream science explanations for this stuff. How do they stack up? Right? We know that, in mainstream literature and biomedical literature, that there's things like sick building syndrome, mass psychogenic illness. There is the evolutionary nature of creepiness, the degree to which we place meaning in buildings, and also what we call gestalt, right? Gestalt features of an environment, which is something that we're working on. But there is actually, right, and we actually did a scoping literature review of all of the mainstream data, looking at infrasound, electromagnetic fields, temperature, air quality, lighting levels, as well as some embedded cues, right? So this was kind of a, let's see what the skeptics have come up with in terms of explanations. And we ended up publishing this in Frontiers. But one of the, core findings we found is that, for instance, infrasound, inconsistent findings and very few of it. Lighting levels, little to no direct research done. Air quality, theorized, but not a whole lot of evidence there. In fact, I was kind of, as a believer, shocked that there wasn't more of this. But one of our core findings from the Frontiers model was that environmental effects, physical environmental effects, have simply not been studied sufficiently for anybody to make any sort of mainstream claim reliably about hauntings and poltergeists. It's just, where there is a body of research, it can be inconsistent. I would note, obviously, with a nod of the hat to Persinger, right, that I do think that the sense presence is a real effect. But notably, if you look in the literature, you got to have a very specific frequency to the temporal lobes for that to occur. It has to be patterned and it has to be consistent over a period of time. And I believe his own work indicated maybe 4% of locations might even carry that sort of effect. So, again, mainstream quick physics answers to hauntings, although I have to say personally, well, no, my colleagues would agree with me. Hallucination is a horrible mainstream explanation for hauntings. And if you want my opinion on that, you can ask me after the presentation. But basically, when we look at physical effects for explaining hauntings, there's not a lot there. There needs to be a whole lot more work done if we're going to find any kind of variance explained in the haunting environment by these sort of known physics effects. So, again, it's in its infancy. So there needs to be more designs to study and collect environmental data. Of course, we have developed Mesa 3 as a data logger for phone sensors, if anybody's interested in that and doing studies. We definitely need more consistent and precise measurements of variables. We may need to look at individual differences in people's sensitivity to the environment, and their attitudes and influences in the interpretation of environmental stimuli. So what I might say there really is more of an examination of their transliminal tendencies in relation to these sort of physical effects. And we are currently working on standardizing measures for the Gestalt influences, right? So kind of the overall aspect or feelsies of a location. In terms of hopefully being able to create a standardized measure that people can use to kind of maybe suss out some of the mainstream physical differences that we see in a location, notably different from what Kruth is theorizing, which I wouldn't necessarily disagree with at all. But of course, our approach in this is let's do the kit and caboodle. Let's not take one side. Let's get the mainstream physical stuff, and now let's look at alternative hypotheses and two. Let's see what falls out of the mix. Now, notably, there is one exception to our physical variables paper, which is I've conducted 2 field studies where I've been able to show that there is a change in variability, what we would call micro expansion or micro suppression of electromagnetic fields, if you data log them in real time in association with O phenomena, like witnessing shadow people, seeing objects move. In fact, in 2019, we did a paper where 2 beach balls moved off the bedstand of a bed 11 times in about an hour and 10 minutes. And I actually had a good data logging EMF meter there, as well as control. We also, back in 2013 with Black Moon Manor, were able to associate some very clear EVP and a series of actual shadow people under very controlled conditions coming out. And we found this micro expansion or compression of electromagnetic fields in the variance, right? Not the magnitude. So in other words, the wiggle appears, at least from my research, to be where there may be a real relationship with electromagnetic fields and objective phenomena. But notably, we also did a seance study in 2017, and we were able to associate a compression or expansion of electromagnetic fields with when people reported subjective phenomena. So whether it is just, it looks like from at least the research I've done so far, and I'm hoping someone wants to replicate it at some point. I know Stanley Coren is looking at some of the findings independently. But we're seeing across 3 studies that whether it's a subjective event or an objective event, if you're using data logging, and you look at the variability of EMF, either right before or during the event itself, you're going to find a correlation in time. Notably, I would say from this that magnitude readings of EMF are relatively pointless. Because so far I've collected a lot of data sets over the years. So far, I'm not necessarily seeing abnormal magnitude, right? In other words, the strength of EMF overall in locations, but that variability seems to be where the magic is. And I'll be happy if somebody can debunk it. I just want to see somebody besides me doing it. So, we're also, trying currently to get groups together, and it's been some up and downs because we had some issues with Mesa 3 that I just now got fixed. But we're trying to collect environmental data with citizen scientists, with lay people. Making sure that we're using appropriate ethics and investigation protocols, and trying to get groups to go out there. I am working with another researcher right now who is working on getting an IRB approved for us to use about 60 students to, John, if you're still listening, actually take readings of graveyards as a sacred space. And compare that to controls to see if we're actually going to see any environmental differences in the data. And I'll be, if you're interested, I'll be happy to share that with you. So stitching it all together, right? So when we look at, there's certain traits, transliminality and paranormal belief, when we know there's a core set of phenomena that occurs in a unidimensional scale, and we know that the physical environment is kind of iffy on its effects, how do we make sense of all these pieces of data when it comes to haunting? And that brings us to haunted people syndrome. Um, and I want to be careful with this because I don't want it misconstrued as some sort of attempt at medical diagnosis. But we do think from the data and the papers we published and the evidence that we've collected that ghostly episodes are an interactionist phenomena, and it involves the right people in the right settings. Right. So, transliminality, we think, is probably the foundation for anomalous experience. And we think that belief in the paranormal reinforces that. Um, Notably, when I talk about, when I'm saying anomalous experience, I want to make it clear we're not saying that anomalous experiences are not real. And in fact, we have some early data right now that's suggesting that environment and transliminality is actually being significantly associated with higher ESP rates. But we're going to keep looking at that. We think dis-ease or a lack of ease, right? So we're not talking about the medical term dis-ease. We're talking about a lack of ease, right? Stimulates transliminality. So, when we look at the Gestalt features of a haunted location, it is giving us certain cues that are likely to create more liminal spaces. Trouble in figuring out, whether something is left, right, up, down, in between, right? So we kind of move in almost like that trickster sort of domain. But we think that lack of clarity in a haunted environment plus transliminality exacerbates it, right? And thus makes people more sensitive to anomalous experiences. We very much think that psychological contagion is occurring. I can say, aside from research, just from personal experience of being in the field for 12 to 15 years, that you can literally watch people give each other the creeps and share phenomena. Which is why if you don't have good communication protocols in place for investigations, and good recording, if you're counting on witness statements, you may be in trouble. Because it is very easy to unconsciously influence another person towards seeing and interpreting things in a certain kind of way. We also think, and by the way, with contagion, notably, and this is where my believer skepticism comes in, notably there's a lot of studies on contagion, but nobody can tell you how it actually works. So I would say, in the seance environment I was like, oh, well, you could say it's their nonverbal cues, or unconsciously a person read someone else so that they ended up sharing the same symptom, or you could posit ESP, or you could posit spiritual influence. And frankly, even in mainstream research, if you dig deeply into contagion effects, they don't have a mechanism for contagion. There's not a shred of evidence for a mechanism for contagion. So for those of you of a kind of a believer background, you're welcome to dig around in there, because really you could posit all sorts of parapsychological effects in social contagion. And technically, the mainstream scientists would not be able to stop you. But point D, attributions in a haunting environment align to the experience biopsychosocial context. So, the point here is understanding that if you are from a Christian background, and you have haunting experiences, you are likely to interpret that as a demon or an evil spirit. However, if you are a Buddhist, you may interpret that as a hungry ghost or an ancestor who's wishing to make contact with you. If you are a medium, you may believe it's a spirit guide. Notably, what I want to make clear here is the phenomena stays the same. If two people, if a skeptic and a believer in the same room see an object moving, one will say it's a ghost, the other will say it's hoaxed, right? I'm using stereotypes here, but work with me. Notice that that's just interpretation. The core event that was witnessed by both was the exact same thing. The object moved. Again, emphasizing that our beliefs and interpretations all the time are adding information to the core experiences and phenomena that we're capturing. And then our last component of HPS is that anxiety is going to rise and distress is going to rise as the type of phenomena, the closeness of it, and the expectedness of it, right, change. So obviously a person is likely to be more distressed and disturbed by haunting experiences if they're happening without warning, they're happening, close to the individual, or happening in a psychological domain that's close to the individual, like it's happening to their child, right? And if the phenomena itself is severe, right? It's one thing to get a sense presence. It's another thing to have an object thrown against the wall and break. And so as a function of the type of experiences that they're having, this altogether is creating what we're calling haunted people syndrome, right? This ongoing tendency for people to have these haunting experiences, and in some cases be distressed by them. And of course, also in some cases, creating interpersonal conflict and some other issues as they continue to experience these type of phenomena over time, possibly fueled by contagion from their family and their belief structures. So what about the paranormal, right? Notice all of this, and this is kind of a key point of why we wrote this book. There's not a single study in our book that cares if you are a believer or a skeptic. The models are all still predictive and useful, right? It's model building. We use very little interpretation, at least I would say. You guys may come after me after this. But at the end of the day, HPS, haunted people syndrome, it doesn't matter whether the phenomena itself is parapsychological or not. I think there's a good case to be made for that, by the way, but it doesn't have to be. In other words, these models are mainstream science and skeptic friendly. They will work and they will predict, regardless of whether or not you believe in the person telling the truth about seeing an object move, a fire start, or seeing an apparition, right? But we would again note that transliminality and belief has correlated with outcomes of tests of ESP. From years ago, and we just completed a replication in June where we found that ESP rates appear to be a good chunk higher if they're doing the tests, if they're high transliminals, and they're doing the tests in an actual haunted location where phenomena occurs. Right, but again, none of these models and none of what I've presented tonight requires you to believe in paranormal phenomena, and it doesn't require you to disbelieve in paranormal phenomena. These predictors remain, decent modelers for the effects. So, closing notes. We are currently working on an ongoing podcast called Practical Parapsychology. What we're trying to do there is bring some of the research scientists to the lay people, to ghost hunting groups, right? It boggles my mind over the years that there are millions of ghost hunters out there, millions of people that are watching all of these television shows, and they don't even know that the Journal of Parapsychology exists. They don't even know that JSE exists, the Australian Journal of Parapsychology exists. They're not even aware that there have been researchers going at this for 100 years. And so we're trying to bring some of the science to the laity, so to speak. You're welcome to check it out if you like. And frankly, if any of you guys want to be interviewed about your research, please contact me. We will find a way to get you fit in at some point because we're trying to get an audience going with amateurs and trying to provide them tools and scales and measures for them to be able to apply these in the real world. And if we're really lucky, maybe we can get enough of them to agree on using the same protocol, and then we get large scale citizen science data, which I can say honestly is a lot more work than I'm letting on about, but we're going to keep chugging at it until we get there. So thank you, and questions.
Thanks, Brian. There was a question posted. Can you please define gang stalking?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Gang stalking is when a person believes that there is a group of very real individuals that are trying to drive them insane. Right. So it's the idea, it's kind of like that black ops CIA sort of thing where, like they will come into your house at night, move your objects without you knowing about it. And then you wake up and things are moved. Or, random strangers come up to you and talk to you and ask you for something, or suddenly your keys are missing, or suddenly you're getting a message out of nowhere on your phone that you can't identify. Right. But instead of blaming a ghost for this sort of stuff and gang stalking, it's an assumption that there's like this collaboration of people behind the scenes slowly trying to drive you insane. And believe it or not, it's an uncommon phenomena, but it's not just an isolated phenomena. There's some books and a fair amount of accounts out there on it.
And is that a relatively modern theme, gang stalking, or has it been?
Well, I can't tell you. I can't tell you when it started. I know I heard about it maybe 15, 16 years ago. It may go back a lot further than that. And I'm sure somebody that's like a fan of conspiracy theory could probably cite Lord knows how many instances. Although you might say that a form of gang stalking could be paralleled to some of the MIB encounters, Men in Black encounters that people report back in the day.
Interesting.
Something along the lines of gaslighting?
Yes.
Or is it the same thing, basically?
Well, I would say gang stalking is like a group form of gaslighting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, like an individual can gaslight you by trying to make you feel silly or make you feel wrong about something that you know to be true, right? Gang stalking would be gaslighting applied by 15 people in a group project that in theory you can't see, all to make your life scary and miserable.
Yeah, they're doing the same thing in an old study where you have a group of Confederates saying the shortest line is the longest line, and one individual who's not in on it can't understand why they're identifying the shortest line as the longest line, and it's basically like a peer pressure test. And
oh yeah,
on the same lines.
Yeah, that makes me think of Ash's, famous studies where, 1/3 of the people agreed that an obviously shorter line was a longer line, right?
Yeah,
just because everybody else in the peer group told them it was the longest line and they didn't want to upset the group. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Can
I
I
just ask a quick question about the subjective objective? You said that it's a single factor, which is quite surprising. But you said it shows up at different levels. The subjective and objective show up at different levels, but yet it's one factor. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and this is where it gets tricky because the SSE really doesn't is really kind of structured differently than like your standard, 26 item Likert scale, right? It is a yes/no scale, so we're dealing with, frequency counts. We're dealing with probabilities, and because it's Roche scaled, items are allowed to become more or less probable depending on the group that you're dealing with. Right. So if I'm going to look at people who are lifestylers, right? So these are people that go on ghost tours and haunts and maybe have an investigative team. The probability structure of the items, right? What's common and less common. For instance, if you're dealing with a lifestyle group, you might very easily see that psychokinesis is a little bit more common in their group on the scale than it would be in a spontaneous account. But it always keeps its unidimensional structure. Only the probabilities of the items shift around depending on the group that you're dealing with. Does that make sense?
Somewhat, yeah.
So what you would do is use different groups to compare probability profiles of what are common and less common features for different types of groups that you're going to assess. So you could do a comparison of very active investigators versus people that just have spontaneous accounts. And you can look at the item or logit shifts, right, in probability between the high haunter group, the group that's always exposed to it, versus people that have occasional spontaneous accounts. And you can kind of make a model of probability about what, if you were to take an average lifestyler or an average intense haunter versus a spontaneous person, you can make an accurate prediction in terms of the phenomena they're likely to encounter.
So what are you calling that factor?
We don't have a name for it. It's just one, because it's just one factor. It's just a unidimensional structure of common, less common, and rare haunting phenomena. So I like calling it the backbone of high strangeness, but I think there's a lot more research that we need to do before I really get to be brave and ballsy and make that claim.
Well, if it's a factor that I'm understanding, it's the factors usually named after the items that load on.
Yes, but Roche scaling does not work on standard factor analysis. It mandates a Gutman curve. So basically, it requires a 50% to 50% ratio of probability to trait that would predict that ability, which is why SAT tests are so different, right? If you've taken a modern version of that test, it'll ask you a few questions, and those first few questions are basically to gauge your initial level or ability. And then it will fine tune in on questions that match that ability that you have. And the reason it can do that is that it requires that all of the items in an SAT, or in our case, a haunt scale, fit a Gutman curve, fit this distribution, right? that requires the items to be basically interval level scaling and related to the inherent tradeability of the person taking the scale. So it is a different mathematics function than just standard factor analysis, which is basically just looking at correlational clusters and rotating them to get the best fit. This one has a presupposition of model fitting of a Gutman curve. And if the items don't fit that Gutman curve, then they get tossed out.
Right. Okay. What do you think the advantage there is? I mean, is it wrong to say that the subjective experience, the psychological response to something in the environment is found out better than a physical effect in the environment, like a sudden drop in temperature or something? Or do they have equal importance? Or because the psychologist is going to come in and say, well, the psychological stuff is obviously hallucination and it's something else, you've imagined it, whereas the PK stuff, or the external stuff, I have no answer for what that may be.
Sure.
I might appeal to the environment or geographical effects or something, geological effects or whatever.
I would step back from that and say, psychologists can make a claim that something subjective is purely an internal psychological mechanism, but they don't know any better than we do. I think in real life of instances where I've seen handprints and scratches appear on people, right? And I think of instances where I've even seen a person slap down to the ground, right, in a room. Now, here's where we get tricky, and we kind of talk about this a lot in Ghosted, because we're like, let's be honest about what you can and can't measure and explain. I think that's really crucial. So I could say, since I have a lot of clinical psychologists that work for me, I deal with clinical stuff all the time. Well, I could be, oh, well, that's a somatoform disorder. Your mind made you produce a scratch or a cut on your body. That's not proof. I'm not running an MRI. I can't get inside that person's head. You could say, in fairness, if we're being objective, you could go, no, a ghost did it. You have two competing hypotheses. Now, how do I get inside the person and figure that out? And I think the fair answer is you can't. It could, in theory, be either. Until we find a way to get inside the person, there's no way to know that. Same thing with somebody knocked down. You could be like, well, was that a psychosomatic effect, or did a ghost push them? And you could even get very detailed and get if you got a camera, if you got video of it, blow that up and look for an indent maybe in their jacket or something. But again, speculative evidence. That's one possible explanation of 50. If we're being really objective about it, internal events are still very mysterious. Yes, we have psychological labels for explaining some of these, but to even infer in mainstream science or clinical psychology that they've got causal mechanisms down, well, that's just, we're not there yet. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying, let's be honest, they're not there yet. But to your other part of the question, objective phenomena, yes, right? That's a lot easier to deal with. And that's why I focus my early studies on that, because I'm like, look, an object moving is an object moving. Explain that. Hey, these 7-foot tall shadows coming out of a basement with only one entrance or exit, and I've got all the other entrances covered by cameras. Explain that, right? Those are, I think, very much better evidence of paranormality, just because they are external. But that doesn't necessarily make them better than subjective events. I think subjective events may be the deeper mystery in some ways.
Yeah, I'm got the impression from that first slide where you showed that the RAS scaling has made the subjective as deeply anomalous as the objective experience.
Well, and because the scale consistently shows that there tends, we've even done a couple of models of some poltergeist cases, quote unquote, where there does seem to be kind of like this wave pattern of buildup. And I've seen from previous personal experience, as well as the scale, that very often you'll have subjective experiences kind of building up to a, oh my God, objective experience. So no, I think they are deeply intertwined. Yeah. I think they are legitimately intertwined. And we have a lot more work to do to tease out what that means and to get better information about it.
It was a very interesting case. if you remember, the father was a truckie, and he'd been having powerful psychic experiences all of his life since he was a little child. And we managed to clear up entity that bugged him. Who grabbed the steering wheel. He's driving these 90-ton semi-trailers interstate, and so anyway, we managed to end that. And but then the mother was so fascinated by the psychic experiences. We kept telling her just leave it alone, but because she was endlessly fascinated by it, she kept attracting it, and of course, it was affecting the 12-year-old girl.
Rob.
Yeah,
Rob and Tilly, I want to make a point because I've had several cases where I've given people meditational, meditation exercises to help them try to control mental intrusions and thoughts, right? What we could also translate to, spirit intrusion, if you prefer, right? Because mediums get a sense of that coming in, and they drop it after 3 or 4 weeks because it was working, but they liked the phenomena happening because they liked the attention it gave them.
That's it. They're both frightened and fascinated by the experience. And I said to you, we were up there with a film crew. We got all this recorded. And I said to the film crew, once she loses interest in this subject and becomes bored with it, it'll stop. It'll stop.
Yep.
And that's usually because the bad spooks can't get an emotional reaction out of her or the daughter anymore. It becomes boring for them, so they wander off and find somebody else to torment. That's my understanding of it.
Yeah, Walter von Lucadow has a theory with this model of pragmatic information, where when the novelty goes into decline, the effects stop. Because the camera crew is also breaking into this closed system that they have.
Yeah.
It's an organisationally closed system, Brian, you probably know about that. And the camera crew is breaking into that, so the stuff stops. It happened with the infill poltergeist. Once the crew comes in, the stuff stops. The events stop. But what you're talking about, the novelty aspect as well, once that sort of goes into decline and the individual loses interest, the effects stop as well.
Yeah, and because I've been clearing haunted houses for 35 years, I've done 550 cases of possession and poltergeist haunting cases. I just find it all a bit boring. So the bad never get a reaction out of me.
Yeah.
Doesn't frighten me at all.
Vlad, you got a question?
Yeah, thank you. Lower my
Hi,
hand.
Vlad.
Hello. It was actually a quick question to do with, you mentioned EMF micro contractions and micro expansions during the.
Yes.
Yep. Can you explain that to me? How do you actually measure the variability?
Okay, so you need a data logger, right? And fear not, for the last 4 years, I've been developing an application that works on Android phones called Mesa 3. That is free to download and uses your phone sensors, and then will data log EMF at 5 samples a second, and then every 5 seconds produce a distribution for you with mean, median, the amount of high and low spikes, 2 standard deviations, right? As well as the overall sample size. But before that, I had to build my own. And then before that, I had to cobble together almost a truckload of equipment to do that sort of work. But I would say, and if I'm sorry if it sounds snobby, anybody running around with a tri-field or a K2 meter is basically wasting their time. The variability, which is basically, instead of how high is the EMF, we're asking ourselves, how much is it wiggling? Right? So if you've ever held an EMF meter, you'll notice it goes up and down a little bit. And depending on the environment, it may spike up and then go down. Well, what we're seeing with haunt phenomena is that either before the event, the variability, the change in readings over time will expand, right? The wiggle will get big, or in some cases, it will go from big and it'll compress to small, significantly so. The point here is not that it is EMF from outside sources. The point is that there's a correlation in time with a change in variability with the phenomena occurring.
Sorry, just to clarify, this wiggle that gets larger or smaller, what is the wiggle? Is that magnitude or is that frequency?
Change in magnitude scores. How much is the magnitude score changing, right? Think of it as a wavelength. Okay. How much is the wave shrinking or expanding over time?
Okay, over time.
And so again, the only way you can collect that is if you're collecting multiple samples per second over time to study that effect.
Interestingly, I was doing some analysis of geomagnetic fluctuations, so magnetic storm activity, and again, there was a hint there that it wasn't so much the magnitude of activity, it wasn't the strength of the storm, it was actually the more quiet periods where something would be more likely to occur. People would report more haunting activity.
Now, I do want to make it clear though, because people tend to assume that I'm worried about, well, where's the EMF coming from? No. The way I do this analysis, the anomaly is not that EMF is changing, right? EMF changes everywhere. The anomaly is that we shouldn't see specific changes occurring in sync with time, right? With this type of phenomena occurring. So it's really a correlation between EMF, the phenomena, and time, right? Not some sort of explanation about where the EMF comes from. That's irrelevant, right? There's no reason for known physics to tell us that paranormal phenomena should be correlated in time with a change in EMF. Should not happen, and yet it has multiple times in multiple studies.
All right, thanks. Don, sorry.
Sorry,
You want one more quick question?
Just wanted to mention one observation that I made. When you were talking about things following people when they move house, I've had two instances now which I find really intriguing of people reporting being haunted or being actually poltergeist activity in one case, and affecting the bedroom to such an extent that they would have to move to a different bedroom. And what they would find is that the activity would stop for 2 or 3 days. It's almost as if they couldn't find the person for 2 or 3 days, and then the activity would pick up again, and then they'd have to move once again. And I also found this with a lady who almost like that gang, I'm not sure what you call it, gang stalking,
yeah,
that kind of mentality where she thought the government was trying to impose thoughts in her head. It was a lot of paranoia, but she also found that it wasn't until she moved to a new house that the activity would stop for 2 or 3 days, and then it would come back. And that I just found that really intriguing, because it kind of falls into someone's idea of perhaps a extra dimensional type of interpretation of,
or is it the person's simple belief that they moved sufficient
or it could be
to create a gap in the phenomena, whether you want to use living agent psi or intelligent entity or both. Right? To what extent are our beliefs and our expectations shaping this interaction? If you want to go down that route.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, that's it.
Thank you.
I'd make a couple of points on that. Yes, I've absolutely have seen it in hauntings. It typically is when someone takes an object from a place, if there's legitimate phenomena. And I've had several instances over the years of people getting some really weird stuff, including psychokinesis, because they decided to take home a souvenir. Will follow you. It certainly has a long occult historical literature to it, without a doubt. Very much has parallels between like MIB encounters, haunting encounters. And I do know of a couple of citizen scientists right now that are trying to do some research papers on that to kind of look at its prevalence. For whatever explanation you'd like to use for it, mainstream or otherwise, it appears to be a real phenomena. It appears to be a correlation that occurs. And so I'd be very interested for people to start digging into those accounts, looking at the kind of phenomena they get, where they think the quote unquote contagion occurred, to try and get to the bottom of that. Because I think that is very much a phenomena that people have reported, particularly in the haunting world, in the investigation world. But the more I study kind of, Bigfoot phenomena, UFO phenomena, weird, alien conspiracies and that sort of stuff, which I love to learn about, right? They've got parallels in those domains too.
Thank you so much, Brian. That has been very intriguing, and so much work you've put in the measurements and so many variables that we don't think about that can interact with our experiences in the paranormal. So you've got a podcast called Practical Parapsychology, and do we just go into the website and join, or?
No, the website's free. We're on right now a Canadian TV and broadcast network. But episodes are being loaded up to Spotify and most of the podcast catchers. And we intend to continue this either in video format or in just podcast format for as long as we can find the free time to do it, because we want lay people to have access. So again, if any of you guys would like to come on and talk about your actual research, email me. And because we want people to know that there are scientists out there trying to kind of piece this stuff together. So if anybody's interested, please, reach out and email me, and we'll try and figure out a time to fit you in and interview you.
Fantastic, thank you. And you've got a book called Ghosted, Exploring the Haunting Reality of Paranormal Encounters, if you want to know more. And the free MESA 3.0 is a free application that you can use in your paranormal investigating.
Yep. And by the way, we're also creating in Google Forms, we're submitting this shortly. We've just created a standardized ESP app on a Google form.
Oh, wow.
That literally, if you have a Google account, we can be like, here you go, run some subjects. Or, hey, group of people that say you're haunted, fill out this transliminality scale, this paranormal belief scale, and now take this ESP scale at home so we can see if maybe you got a little bit of psychicism going on. Again, the whole goal as we do this research is to try and create tools that everybody can use that are standardized, admitting that we may not have it perfectly right. We can be wrong, but at least we're starting to get some stuff out there that people can use in the community.
Thank you very much, Brian. Yeah, it's been fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.